as we continue we're looking at the length and the empires and the prophets. We looked at Ezekiel, now we're going to look at Daniel. So let's take a look at Daniel. Here's what we have right here. The book of Daniel is a fascinating little book in the Old Testament. And we get asked all the time, what's the difference between a major prophet and a minor prophet? The answer, how much material they get. So there are longer books, we call those major prophets, and shorter books like Habakkuk and Obadiah that we call minor prophets, just how long they are. And Daniel is one of our major prophets, but he's one of the shorter ones of our major prophets. And here's what we see. Daniel, once again, is one of the best and brightest sent into Babylonian captivity. He's not a priest nor a prophet, which is a little bit unusual. He has deep conviction. When you read the story of Daniel, here's the backdrop that you've got to put in your mind. Daniel has been forced from his home in his homeland. He's growing up in foreign hostile territory, and he's trying to figure out what it looks like to worship and serve Yahweh alone, even when all the circumstances around you seem to have blown up in your face. Even when those around you would persecute you and force you to live contrary to Yahweh. And what Daniel and his friends, we're going to see some of his friends are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three guys, they're going to live faithfully and ruthlessly for Yahweh, even when the culture around them is basically blowing up in their face. And that's, for me, really instructive reading when we think about what does it look like to be the church growing up, living in a culture that oftentimes is hostile and doesn't understand the things of Yahweh, the things of God. And here's a chart for the book of Daniel, just so you can see it. Daniel's really interesting in that it's one of the few books where it's primarily written in two different languages and it's done completely on purpose. And so chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, chapters 8 to 12 are written in Hebrew, but the middle sections, 2 to 7, are written in Aramaic, which would be the language that Babylonians would have more readily understood. And so there's your outline of the book. If you turn the page to page 151, here's the basic story, the basic message. Chapters 1 to 6 give us stories of, we might say, faithfulness of God's people, even in the face of a culture that's against them. The last story in chapter 6 is an individual facing down the beasts. It's Daniel in the lion's den. Chapter 7 will be Daniel's vision of beasts who are encircling God's people. So chapter 6, we have one of God's faithful few surrounded by beasts. Chapter 7, we're going to have God's faithful Israel surrounded by beasts. And in chapter 7, we're going to be playing off of chapter 2. Chapter 7 is going to give us what we're calling here panoramic and apocalyptic view of the empires of the world around Israel. And it's incredible, and it's so fun, and it can be so mind-boggling to read. And when we reflect on if Daniel was writing these things in the 500s BC, then what Daniel will write will come to pass so accurately that I actually had professors of mine at the secular school that I went to at the U of A tell me that there's no way Daniel could have been written in the 500s because it's so accurate. It had to be written later because there's no way somebody could prophesy this accurately. That's how cool Daniel is. And we might note some of the distinctives. It's riveting. It's fascinating. The stories are really fun to read. Visions and dreams are prominent. They bounce back and forth in the story of Daniel. And what we're going to notice is this theme of 70 weeks, which we're going to pick up next week. Just to simply highlight for you Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are essentially the same vision, but seen from two different perspectives. And we have it charted for you right here. In Daniel chapter 2, the Babylonian king, his name is Nebuchadnezzar, has a dream. And nobody can interpret the dream, and they bring Daniel in to interpret it. And Daniel says, here's what your dream was. You dreamed of a beautiful statue made up of different metals. And if you're like me, oftentimes we read books like Daniel or Ezekiel or Revelation in the New Testament, we go, this is so confusing. How could I know what this means? All the symbolic language. Well, usually if we calm down and read a little further, oftentimes the symbol will be described for us. The symbol will be interpreted for us. It's exactly what we have in Daniel 2 and 7. Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar that the statue represents, the different metals represent different kings and kingdoms that will arise in the Near Eastern world. These will be major players, empires in the world. And he says, you, king, are the first one. You are the head of gold. The Babylonian king is the head of gold. But then there's going to be different kingdoms that will arise. And Daniel is essentially predicting the kingdoms that will rule and reign in the Near Eastern world in the subsequent centuries. And we're going to see those fall to be Babylon, then Persia. And for just historical context, Persia, the Persian Empire is the one that battles the Greeks, the Spartan Greeks at the Battle of Thermopylae, the movie 300, the famous 300. That's the Persian army fighting against the Greek army. And when the Persian army eventually gets defeated, next the Greek army becomes the dominant force at the hand of Alexander the Great. And that's going to be in the 300s BC. I'm a history nerd, so go here with me. And then Greece will eventually be taken over by the upstart Roman Empire that will become the most powerful empire in the world, and that will be the empire at the time of Jesus. Now that's chapter 2. Chapter 7 will be the very same thing, except now, instead of a beautiful statue, the image is of disgusting, gross, vicious beasts. And here's an interesting point. When a world ruler who is in the world system sees worldly power, he sees that as beautiful. Nebuchadnezzar sees power and domination and military victory and conquest, and he sees it as beautiful. In chapter 7, Daniel has the vision. And when he sees world power and when he sees military conquest, it's ghastly, it's beastly. And I think that should be drawing our attention to something. When we, as followers of Jesus, as Yahweh people, as Jesus people in the world, we have a different reaction to worldly power, to political might. We have a different reaction to that kind of power, to domination and military victory. Where the world sees that as beautiful and a way to win and conquer, oftentimes Jesus will flip that on its head. Remember in Matthew chapter 10 or Mark chapter 10 when Jesus says, I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give my life as a ransom for many. He says, if you want to be great, you actually have to be the slave of all. He's flipping the world system on its head. And in Daniel chapter 7, he has a vision of 4 beasts. And these 4 beasts will represent the same 4 kingdoms. Those beasts, the beasts look like this. There's a winged lion, which by the way was the national symbol, the artistic symbol for Babylon. Then he has a very powerful bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, tipped on one side. That's the Persian Empire. Then we have a swift-moving leopard with 4 wings. That's going to be the Greek Empire. And then the last one, it doesn't give us an animal that corresponds to it. We call it here the terrifying beast or the super beast. This super beast is going to have some chronology to it. It's going to have 10 horns, and then 3 will fall away, and then 1 will rise up, and this little horn is kind of crazy. What's going on? And Daniel will have that vision interpreted for him as well. What is interesting about both these visions, we don't have it printed here, but in both the visions, we see God's kingdom come and defeat all of these worldly kingdoms. In Daniel 2, it's a stone carved without hands. And in Daniel 7, it is God's thrones. We're told it's plural, thrones, with God, the Ancient of Days, sitting on the throne, and then a Son of Man figure coming up to ascend to the throne of God, being handed a kingdom. And whoever this Son of Man is elevated to the place of sitting on God's throne. And what's interesting is when we turn to the New Testament, Jesus' favorite way to speak of himself is right out of Daniel 7. He refers to himself more than any other thing as the Son of Man. Jesus is saying, I am that Son of Man, the one who is the rightful ruler, the one who will come and defeat all these world systems and all of their beastly power. I defeat the super beast. That's me. And Jesus will refer to himself as the rightful King, the Son of Man, who is elevated to God's throne. And when we turn to Revelation, for example, the author of Revelation, John, he's just playing off of all these ideas and all these pictures that we get from our Old Testament. And oftentimes, when we don't know that, it makes it really confusing. So if you read Daniel 7, then go read Revelation 13, you'll see how John is playing off these 2 things. So that gets us L, the length, E, the empires, and P, the prophets.